Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We started with Captain Malabou's book, The Ontology of the Accident, in the previous lecture, so we'll just carry on from where we left last time. So this should be on your screen, and as you can see, Malabou talks about plasticity and the negative association of plasticity, and in this very section she talks about how the way plasticity is commonly consumed is how it becomes almost like a counterbalance of positivity. But rarely, she says, plasticity is ever articulated as a purely negative phenomenon. And towards the end of this section, we'll find how she is demanding an articulation of plasticity as a purely nihilistic or negative phenomenon, and not something which is connected to a positive phenomenon, right? So she says commonly plasticity and positivity, or plasticity and productivity, are associated together, but she talks about plasticity as a purely destructive category. And that's something which she thinks is more connected to the idea of trauma, or the loss of the self, where a new self emerges out of the old self with no continuity whatsoever. And that, according to her, is an example of plasticity. And she says the very few examples, if any at all, where this pure production of negativity or pure production of an annihilated self or a metamorphosed self is articulated in literature or elsewhere. And later you will find that she talks about Kafka's book Metamorphosis, where Malabou says that it comes very close in terms of articulating this metamorphosis of one organism to another organism. But even so, she says that even that metamorphosis, what is retained is a human voice. What is retained is a focalized frame of the human, the human self. So we find that she will talk about Kafka's Metamorphosis, some details, which will come in the subsequent section, where Malabou says it comes very close to articulating this purely negative phenomenon of plasticity as an emergence of a new order entirely, a new ontological order entirely. But even then, she says that is connected to the idea of the old human self, that is not entirely disconnected. Right? So there is some retaining of a humanist frame, which Kafka doesn't quite manage to get rid of. So anyway, at this point of time, we'll find that she is focusing on how plasticity is commonly considered as a connected quality to productivity, positivity, etc. Right, so, and this should be on your screen. It is generally agreed that plastic construction cannot take place without a certain negativity. To return to the example of neurobiology, the reinforcement of synaptic connections, an increase in the size of volume, occurs when connections are solicited regularly, producing what scientists term long-term potentialization. This is the case, for instance, in learning to play and practicing the piano. But of course, this phenomenon has its opposite when they are rarely or never used and the same connections diminished. This long-term depression explains why it is more difficult to learn to play an instrument in later years than in childhood. Construction is counterbalanced by a form of destruction. This much we know and accept, right? So the whole idea of plasticity as destruction, it is commonly considered to be a connected category to construction, right? And she gives examples of how this long-term potentialization, how the whole idea of the synaptic self, synapses mean the connections between neurons, and that those connections can only happen simultaneously with disconnections. So connections and disconnections of neurons take place at the synapses, and so potentialization and depression happen together. So in the same way, construction and destruction are connected categories. So this is something which we know. So even in common scientific and cultural parlance, this is accepted as a way of representing creativity, destructivity, etc. These are connected categories, creation, destruction happening together. As connected in a connected form, in a connected plane. This much we know and accept. The fact that all creation can only occur at the price of a destructive counterpart is a fundamental law of life. So that's something which in religions and science and cultural theory, different kinds of discourses, we have this connected quality of creation, destruction happening together. It does not contradict life, it makes life possible. As biologist Jean-Claude Ameisen notes, the sculpting of the self assumes cellular annihilation or apoptosis, right? So cellular annihilation, cells must be able to kill themselves in order for the self to emerge, right? So the self is obviously a very complex construct. It is a neural category, it's a biological category, and equally it's an inactive cultural category. So there is this embedded quality of the self, the biological, the cellular, the neural quality of the self, and equally there is an inactive quality of the self as a performance, the self as a cultural construct, the self as something which happens in culture. So this outward looking and inward looking things simultaneously operative in the idea and experience of the self, right? So, and she's quoting a biologist, Jean-Claude Ameisen, who says that cellular annihilation or cellular destruction is what makes life possible. So, cells must be able to die. Cells must be able to destroy themselves in order to regenerate, and that's how the self is created. The human organism, the human body, the human cell system can only emerge and evolve with destruction, right? If destruction isn't there, there can be no creation or recreation or regeneration. So, and there's an example given: in order for fingers to form, a separation between the fingers must also form. So, for an infant to have fingers, fully formed fingers, cells must separate away from each other. Cells must die away from each other. Cells must disconnect from each other for the gaps between fingers to form. So for fully formed fingers, the gaps between fingers must also form. So again, this is a very direct and biological example of cellular annihilation connected to cellular creation, right? So the created fingers of a particular hand, it can only happen when the fingers also have gaps between them, right? Or cells between fingers must go away. So for the very formation of fingers is contingent on the destruction of cells, the disconnect of cells. And that's connect-disconnect quality is something which we always see happening. It is apoptosis that produces the interstitial void that enables fingers to detach themselves from one another, right? So apoptosis or cellular suicide, it is something which creates or produces the interstitial void. Interstitial meaning between the fingers. So the void between the fingers can only be produced by cellular suicide, when cells kill each other, right? Okay. And then she goes on to say that, even the next paragraph, which should be on the screen, even in psychoanalysis, destructive plasticity, it doesn't contradict positive plasticity, right? Destruction, it doesn't contradict construction, it is its condition. So destruction and construction of cells happen together. Destruction and construction of selves happen together in psychoanalysis. And she goes on to say, it serves the neatness and power of realized form. In its own way, it composes a life force. In psychoanalysis, as in neurology, a plastic brain or plastic psyche is one that finds the right balance between the capacity for change and the aptitude for remaining the same, between what is to come and memory, between the giving and receiving of form. So becoming and unbecoming, memory and appearance of memory, or emergence of memory, remembering and emergence, they happen simultaneously in psychoanalysis as well as in neurobiology. So as we can see, Malabou is spending a lot of time here talking about a certain kind of destructive plasticity, which is almost welcomed, which has been articulated in several ways, in several forms, in different kinds of discourses, scientific, neuroscientific, cultural, theoretical, existential, phenomenological, all kinds of discourses have a room for destructive plasticity, as long as it is connected to construction, as long as it is connected to positivity or productivity. Now, she says there is almost no room at all. There's almost no articulation or theorization at all when it comes to pure plasticity, when it comes to pure destructive plasticity, a destructive plasticity which does not retain any positivity, which does not retain any connect to any old, earlier form, but which emerges as a new form entirely, right, as a monstrous new order. So for that kind of plasticity, for that kind of destructive plasticity, there's hardly any theory, there's hardly any articulation. And what this book does, in some sense, is to make an effort or attempt to articulate that destructive plasticity in philosophy, in neuroscience, and different other discourses. And then she goes on to say, it's an entirely different matter when it comes to the possibility of explosion, the annihilation of equilibrium, the destruction of this capacity, this form, this force, this general identity, right? So as long as Destruction is balanced with construction. As long as destruction comes as a counterpoint to construction, destruction is welcomed, theorized, articulated, given a shape, given a form, given a definition of sorts. But she says it's an entirely different matter when it comes to the possibility of explosion, the explosion of the old self and the birth of an entirely new self, which is completely disconnected from any earlier self, any prototype, as it were. And that kind of explosion also entails the annihilation of equilibrium. So there is a complete loss of balance in some sense. There's no balance at all. So equilibrium is entirely destroyed when this kind of explosion happens. The destruction of this capacity, this form, this force, this general identity. So the last word over here is interesting, identity, right? So it almost becomes some kind of a post-identity experience, right, where a new identity is formed which does not retain any atom or any connector or any residual legacy of the earlier identity, right? So this new identity which comes out of which emerges out of explosion is something which is entirely new, a different ontological order, a new ontological order entirely, right? And Malabou says there seems to be some kind of an aporia. An aporia, of course, is a gap in knowledge, a gap in definition. It's like a fault line that cannot be crossed in some sense. So there seems to be some kind of an aporia about the definition of this kind of explosion, or the pure plasticity which comes out of explosion, which is not really a game of balance and counterbalance. It's a game about annihilation of balance, annihilation of equilibrium entirely. So for that experience, there's hardly any definition given, or hardly any concept offered. Terrorism versus apoptosis. As I said, in these instances, no one calls it plasticity anymore. So even the word plasticity is not used because the word plasticity almost always retains some positive implications, some positive connotation. Okay. Even if the destructive and disorganizing explosive power is present virtually in each of us, ready to manifest itself, to take body or self-actualize at any moment, it has never received a name in any field whatsoever, right? So this is almost the project of this book. The aspiration of this book is to give the ontology of the accident, or to ontologize accident in some sense. And you can replace the word accident with trauma, and we find how this neatly fits in a course like this. Because what Malabou is saying is that trauma, by definition, is undefinable because it resides outside of the parameters of possibility, right? But if we can at least attempt to locate it, if you attempt to give it a name, if you attempt to give it some shape, some form, some definition, some concept, that helps us in terms of understanding or engaging with it, right? So the idea of trauma as elsewhere, the idea of trauma as a different kind of space and time, a different kind of identity, a different sense of self that emerges readily in Malabou's study, recursively in Malabou's study. So what she's doing is interesting. At first she's saying, we have an idea of plasticity, we have an idea of destruction, which we commonly consume and almost welcome sometimes as some kind of a counterbalancing force, some kind of a counterpoint to production and positivity. But what if we have an experience of destruction which is explosive in quality, which explodes away all possibilities, all original identities, and instead opens up a possibility of a pure annihilation, pure destruction, which is not connected, which doesn't have to connect itself to any old ontological order, right? And she says there is no definition for that, there's no name for that, there's no theory for that. So she talks about trauma as elsewhere, she talks about trauma as a deterritorializing experience, which completely deterritorializes your sense of space, time, identity, everything, right? And she says, is it possible for us to define the deterritorialization, to define the deterritorializing experience of trauma? And this book becomes an attempt to ontologize that in some sense, right? Okay. And then she goes on to say, never has the power of ontological and existential explosive plasticity for subjectivity and identity been granted an identity, right? So that identity has never been granted because in some sense it is post-identity, is outside of the parameters of identity, is outside the parameters of language and possibility. So that in that sense becomes an elsewhere to knowledge systems. It becomes an elsewhere, or shall we say an epistemic elsewhere. epistemic is knowledge, elsewhere is outside the fields of knowledge, the boundaries of knowledge, right? So the epistemic elsewhere quality of trauma is something that Malabou is highlighting, that it is always outside of the known parameters of knowledge and definitions and classifications, etc. So it has an aporeatic quality, it's an aporia, it's an elsewhere. So it has never been granted an identity of sorts. Approached but avoided, glimpse often enough in fantasy literature, and she'll talk about Kafka's Metamorphosis later, as I mentioned, but never connected to reality, neglected by psychoanalysis, ignored by philosophy, nameless in neurology, the phenomenon of pathological plasticity, a plasticity that does not repair, a plasticity which without recompense or scar, one which cuts the thread of life in two or more segments that no longer meet, nevertheless has its own phenomenology that demands articulation. Right, so it has its own phenomenology, it has its own phenomenal frame that demands articulation. So it's very clear that the kind of plasticity Malabou talks about is a purely destructive plasticity which cuts into any thread of life. So there's no connect to life as we know it. So it's almost like a detextualization. And in the previous session, if you remember, Malabou was almost talking about life as a textual form, as a textual progress. So life as a river, life as a text, life as a series of inscriptions. What happens when that inscriptions are completely de-inscripted, right? And we will see how that idea of the textuality of life, the textuality of otherness will come into being when Malabou talks about Kafka's literature, the fantasy literature of Kafka, especially Metamorphosis, which is something which we'll see subsequently. But at this point of time, she talks about the phenomenon of pathological plasticity, which is nameless in neurology. So even in medical classification, there's no name for it. In philosophical classification, there is no category for it. Psychoanalysis doesn't deal with it at all. But this is the idea that Malabou talks about, something which cuts the thread of life in two or more segments that no longer meet. So they're completely disconnected. So there's pure production of disconnect in some sense. And that has its own phenomenology that demands articulation in some form, as Malabou says. This being the project of this book in some sense. So phenomenology, indeed, something shows itself when there is damage, a cut, something to which normal creative plasticity gives neither access nor body. The deserting of subjectivity, the distancing of the individual who becomes a stranger to herself. So this production of uncanny. And again, you can see how this can be interestingly mapped onto something like Tobatek saying, or even Mrs. Dalloway for the matter, when Septimus doesn't quite recognize himself. He knows he had some earlier self, but is so distant from what he is at the moment, and obviously disconnected to his PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But the idea is to become a stranger to yourself. That's something which Malabou talks about as well. Who no longer recognizes anyone, who no longer recognizes herself, who no longer remembers herself. So this idea of remembering, if you put a hyphen between re and memory, the ability to remember yourself again to your past life, that disappears entirely. And Toba-texting is a very good example of that. The ability to remember and reconnect and recognize reality is something which is disrupted dramatically in Toba-texting. So Malabou talks about this kind of experience. These types of beings impose a new form on their old form without mediation or transition or glue or accountability. So the glue is important away as a metaphor. So it's not really a seamless transition. It is not connected as a glue to the earlier condition. It is not accountable to anything else that preceded it in some sense. Today versus yesterday in a state of emergency, without foundation, barebacked, sockless. So there's a nakedness to it, sockless, barebacked. Right? The change may equally well emerge from apparently anodyne events. And this is interesting, anodyne being dull. It doesn't really have to be a dramatic, extreme event. It can emerge out of dullness. And we see how Kafka's literature is a good example of that. There's no external shock in Kafka. As long as people are coming back from a war or they are completely shattered by any traumatic encounters they've had, it's a constant absorption of dullness in Kafka, where the anodyne quality, which can equally produce this transition, this complete disconnect from the earlier self, which ultimately proved to be veritable traumas inflecting the course of a life, producing the metamorphosis of someone about whom one says, I would never have guessed they would end up like that. So they end up like that, so they become something else. Right? I would never have guessed they would end up like that. So it's inability to predict how that particular self would emerge is something exactly what Malabou talks about over here. And interestingly, the really interesting original thing that Malabou is offering here is that these kind of transitions, or shall we say this metamorphosis from to another self entirely, this can come not necessarily due to trauma or extreme encounters or extreme experiences, but through dull, ordinary, quotidian experiences as well. So the anodyne quality is important as well as something which should be also regarded as something which can produce a possibility of this kind of metamorphosis. The anodyne quality, the dullness of life, the lack of any impact, the lack of any event, that can produce boredom, ennui. This can produce a transition as well. So again, if you look at modernist literature, if you look at Kafka, if you look at a lot of even Eliot's early poetry, you find there are instances or indications of this kind of changes, right? Prufrock being a good example of that as well. So about whom one would say, I would never have guessed they would end up like that. A vital hitch, a threatening detour that opens up another pathway, one that is unexpected, unpredictable, dark, right? So again, the unpredictability, the unexpected quality, the darkness of this transition is something which is highlighted by Malabou. And again, this can be connected to what I mentioned about aporia. It's a fault line that doesn't have a name. You can't classify it as a boundary. It's just a dark passage. You just step into it, and then it becomes something else. And it cannot be predicted. It cannot be explained. It cannot be accounted for. It cannot be connected, in other words, to any prototype or any early experience that had preceded it in some form. So I'll just stop at this point today. But what is clear already in this section is this is a project of Malabou in this particular book, the ontology of the accident, to ontologize the accident and not look at it from as some kind of an elsewhere. All right, so accident as an elsewhere category needs to have a name as well, needs to be given some kind of an engagement, theoretically as well as philosophically. So the project of this book is to look at destructive plasticity as what it is, not as something connected to productivity, not as something connected to positivity, but as purely destructive plasticity. It demands a name, it is granted a name, and that is the project, that's the aspiration, that's the idea which informs this book by Malabou. So I stop at this point today. I will carry on with this in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.